Well, good morning. I'm Doug Brinkley, and I've been writing on conservation history. I did a book called The Wilderness Warrior on Theodore Roosevelt and John Muir, and all about those really founders of the modern conservation movement. Then I did a book on Alaska called The Quiet World, and I'm currently writing one called Rightful Heritage on Franklin D. Roosevelt and the conservation movement, and how 1 billion trees were planted by the Civilian Conservation Corps to fight drought of the 1930s and the Dust Bowls in the Plain States, the need to build a shelter belt. I'm looking at how a lot of national parks got saved right now by FDR, places like the Everglades, which was really created as a biological zone by FDR, Big Bend, Kings Canyon in California, the Olympics, and also the saving of an endangered species and how that connects to the environment. FDR created Pawtuxet, which is really ground zero for how do you rehabilitate and reestablish wildlife. Theodore Roosevelt had done that in Oklahoma with the Wichita Mountains, and he reintroduced buffalo, and it was a huge success. Well, FDR is responsible for saving iconic animals like the manatee, whooping crane, California condor. It became a new consciousness developing in the 30s and 40s that explodes with the Silent Spring Revolution of Rachel Carson. And so I'm kind of here as sort of a historian looking at things as we get into climate, and I'll go let Tom talk for a few minutes about what he's up to, and then we'll have a conversation, and then we'll go over to Ted. I'm winging it. Nobody told me what I'm supposed to do, so
Okay. Well, since Doug is winging it, maybe I will wing it also. And I'd like to reflect for 1 second. I think people, I was up here yesterday, and I think people basically know that I quit my job to try and push on energy and climate. But I want to make a couple of points from being here for the last 24 hours about what I'm seeing both here and around the country, and how what's going on here relates to what I'm seeing when I go to different states and I talk to volunteers, or when I see on the ground what's happening politically. And I want to start with a very simple idea, which is audience. That this is a very elite audience. The people here are incredibly accomplished, well-educated, thinking in very advanced, sophisticated policy terms. And I think for that audience, the message that we all are talking about, and the message that I really deeply believe in, is one where we are doing a very successful job. I think if you will go around to most of what I would think of as super sophisticated people who think about politics and policy more than 5 minutes a month, we are doing really well. And the question in the United States of America is, how are we doing with everybody else? Which is the 99.5% of the people whose lives are very busy and complicated and pressing, and they don't have a lot of time to think about the things that don't immediately impact themselves and their family. And I would say, in the former, we're kicking ass, and in the latter, we have a long way to go. And in terms of making this something that's granular and hits people in the heart and matters to them, I think we really, I was listening to what Graham Richard was talking about. And Graham, I don't know how many of you heard him, runs something called the Advanced Energy Economy, 23 states, membership business organization, dealing with PUC regulations, how to restructure PUCs, and how to implement the latest EPA regulation. God is in the details. The footnote on page 74 in terms of public utility regulation really matters. And which of us is really down there on page 74 looking at it and arguing with the investor-owned utility about what the impact is going to be? That is actually where we have to be. And so I want to, first of all, start by saying I really, really applaud what Graham is doing in terms of getting out there with people who are doing solar installers who have 400 employees in Arizona. We have to be there. If we're going to make a difference, we can't just hit the people who are focused on policy in the United States. We have to understand how we can reach a much broader audience and make them understand why this is important to them and their families. That's one point I'd like to make. And the second point is this. When we look out into the future, I've seen this from 30 years of being an investor. People basically sit there and they are very conservative in terms of looking like idiots. Nobody likes to look like an idiot. So when you see projections, the projections always look just like that. It's going to kind of go the way it is now with a little bit better. That's a normal projection. And if things look really terrible, so if you're looking at an industry that is going to get eaten by new technology, so if we're looking at the newspaper industry in 1999, when you basically could see a lot of the advertising that they depended on was going to go online. Everybody knew it. This was not a blinding observation. Everybody could see that happening. And then it looks like that. The projections are, it's not going to get better, it's going to stay just like this, which of course is not what happened. That is not actually how the world happens. So when we're looking forward, I think we should be anticipating that the world is not going to look like that. There are going to be a lot of changes. There are going to be events that happen that shake things up. So the world does not really change in 0.3% increments. And we've got to be ahead of those changes, and we've got to use those changes when the time comes so that we reach the broadest audience. And that is the way, if we anticipate what's going to happen, and we're looking forward and we're ahead of it, so when it happens, it fits into what we've said and pushes forward to a broad group of people what we want to have happen, that is how we will succeed in this effort.
Ted?
I'm going to deviate from talking a little bit about climate change, sort of what the markets are going to do. I want to talk a little bit about what's wrong with our political system today. Everyone in this room, I suspect, thinks that Citizens versus United was arguably one of the worst Supreme Court decisions ever made, perhaps since the Dred Scott decision. And I would be curious to know what somebody like Justice Kennedy would think about that decision. He was a swing vote. Is he really comfortable with the consequences of that decision? I would hope not, but I've not had the opportunity to ask him that. What encourages me when I see organizations like Represent Us come along. Some of you may know them, but Represent Us has a very simple idea. It doesn't ask for a constitutional reform. What it says is, let's define legislatively what corruption is. And what we heard earlier from the speaker that preceded us, we heard corruption, whereby all the money is controlled by the Speaker of the House, etc. That's corruption. Corruption also is when members of Congress take contributions from sectors that they directly or indirectly regulate. That, ladies and gentlemen, is corruption. And we should be so outraged by that that we insist that Congress define it as corruption. The Supreme Court can't say that's wrong. And if we were able to get a lot of the money out and define it as corruption, so that if I sit on the Natural Resources Committee, I can't take a contribution from the oil sector, because that's defined as corruption. The second thing that we need to do, in my opinion, is we need to change pretty dramatically the idea of how we go about redistricting our legislative districts. The idea that state legislatures are going to enter into these corrupt bargains with their fellows to say, well, I'll give you this district if you give me that district. And what's the result of that? You get districts that even become hard left or hard right, and there's no competition, and there's very few people in the center left. When you go to Washington, and probably some of you say, gosh, I don't want to go to Washington, it's such an unholy place. When I go to Washington, and I was there 2 weeks ago, and a friend of mine who's a senator invited me to have lunch with him in the Senate dining room. We were the only two people there. The people in Washington don't break bread with each other. They don't know each other. And they sit in their little isolated caucuses. And then they work for you, the American people, maybe 2.5 days a week. They arrive Monday night, depending on how far they're coming from, or Tuesday morning if they live close by. And they work Tuesday and Wednesday and part of Thursday. And then they go back to work in their districts. They don't work in their districts. They're fundraising. That's all they do. They spend 4 days out of the week fundraising. Is that what you want your representatives in Washington to do? In the old days, people in Washington actually spent weekends there. One of my good friends was Gaylord Nelson, a great environmental hero. He and his wife used to have breakfasts and dinners at their house on weekends, and they invite over everybody they could when he was both in the House and in the Senate, and they had these barbecues that people loved to come to. And one day, one of the old Southern bulls came up to Gaylord and said, "Gaylord, that bill you got's the dumbest damn thing I've ever seen. It doesn't make any damn sense. But that bill doesn't affect me at all, and you're such a nice guy, I'm going to vote for it anyway." We need to have that kind of comedy again. And so one of the things that I would really try to encourage you, and we've heard this from Mike Phillips, we've got to get out and we've got to talk to the politicians, and we've got to get more engaged electorally. This, that was a great slip of the tongue, electrically. Maybe I should use that word. But we've got to get engaged in the political process because it's broken and it's not acceptable.
Ted was mentioning Gaylord Nelson, who's considered the father of Earth Day. And in 1970, we were able to get all those people rallying for the first Earth Day. And CBS News brought it huge coverage. Walter Cronkite with Echo, Buddy Barry, Commoner. And it was the public pressure on Earth Day that let Richard Nixon create the Environmental Protection Agency that year. It was fear Nixon had that Ed Muskie was out conservationing him, and he thought he was going to run against Muskie in '72. But nevertheless, Ruckelshaus, the great environmentalist up in Seattle, he drafted the EPA bid, and Nixon ended up signing it off. What can we do now? One of the complaints President Obama has is that the news media lose interest in climate a lot, that we're not giving him a visual. He told me recently he's never been to Alaska ever, President Obama, and he's going to go up there soon and also bring his kids, perhaps see polar bear or look at some of the ecosystem up there as a visual. This was before all the war problems he's grappling with right now. But I'm wondering, what can we do to kind of visualize in a galvanize sort of a more of a groundswell on the climate issue, like they did with Earth Day?
Well, first of all, what Doug is talking about, in Earth Day, 22 million Americans actually came out. Yeah. And it was very dispersed. It was not a centralized thing. They came out because it was a time of extreme, obvious pollution in their local communities, and people were outraged. And out of that 22 million person gathering around the country came not just the EPA, but the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act, all in the Nixon administration. Yeah. So the question is, how are we actually going to make this relevant for Americans? The question that I was asking before about audience. And the answer, I believe, is it has to be local and it has to impact individual people. I think our experience in looking at campaigns where they're dealing with absolutely true scientific facts that are occurring at a far distance geographically from the people you're trying to reach, however real they are. So for instance, the polar bears. You know, I have been to Alaska. I worked in Alaska for a summer, and I took my family back there to show them something beautiful. And it was shocking to me, and I think it was shocking to my, at that point, 6-year-old, to see how fast the snow and the glaciers were retreating. So that was something that was very visceral when we were there, but I promise you that if you go down to the lower 48 and talk about the polar bears, that is not a voting issue. That is not something, do people care about the polar bears? Sure, they care about the polar bears. Do they care enough about the polar bears to change their vote? Absolutely, they do not. So it really isn't a question of this one broad image. The question is, why does someone in Miami care about the fact that our climate is changing and it's because of the way that we're generating and using energy? The reason someone in Miami should care is, number one, the sea is rising, and it's going to run down his or her streets. Number two, storm surge, that when we have storms blowing in, they're going to go deeper and farther, and the damage is going to be greater. Everybody knows those two. Miami is the most exposed city in the world to climate change. What they don't realize is, as the temperature gets hotter, the number of days that it's going to be safe to work outside in southern Florida is going to go down a lot. Depending on the time frame you're looking at a month to 3 additional months where it's going to be unsafe to work outside because it's too hot and humid. It actually will be, you're going to have to stay inside and turn on your air conditioning, which is going to require a lot more energy, somewhat ironically. So I think one of the things we tried to do, we put out a project that brought it down to the county level so that when you say to somebody in Iowa, this is what it means, you're talking about what it means for somebody in Iowa, not somebody in Miami.
Yeah, that's a great.
And when you talk to someone in Iowa, they want to hear what it's going to mean for the productivity of their farms, which are worth $10,000 an acre right now. But that price is going to change when people start to think, if they start to think that the productivity of that farm is going to go down substantially. Are they really, really going to change their vote based on the retreating glaciers in Alaska or the glacier, the park formerly known as Glacier Park in Montana? Probably not, honestly. They're going to be focused very closely on what impacts them personally, the people they love, the people they care about, the people that they live with. And I don't think there's any way to get around the fact that in an audience, you've got to be addressing them very specifically and very locally.
I agree with that completely. Let's give it a hand. What that reminds me of is how Rachel Carson in 1962 did Silent Spring, and there were all sorts of conservationists around then, Stuart Udall and William O. Douglas. But Rachel Carson's book in 62 told all moms, your kid might be getting sick. I mean, she brought that message right into the home. Your backyard may not be safe from pesticides or chemicals, and it created it no longer was the word conservation. Suddenly it became the environment because that book had such an impact, the way that the media played it. Ted, I'm curious, as a Roosevelt, and you've been a Roosevelt Republican, and I would say a bull mooser even, and very loyal to all of that. Is there something that you feel could be done to be to more of a Paul Revere-like way of getting the public to pay a little more attention to climate as the major threat that it is?
Part of it, and I think Tom talked about it, and Graham talked about it in his conversation. History teaches us that you have to change as the environment changes. I look at companies like Polaroid, Eastman Kodak, Xerox. They didn't change, and they don't exist today. I look at a company like IBM, and Lou Gerstner was smart enough to recognize that being in the tablet business didn't make any economic sense, and they sold the tablet business to Lenovo. It was a brilliant decision, and they're still working their way through it. But they are an entirely different company today than they were, say, 15 years ago. I think that same story applies certainly to the utility industry. So we need to understand that. So part of what Tom was saying, I think, we have to tell the story to the American people so they understand in their daily lives what the risk is going to be for them if they continue doing what they're doing, because the risk is enormous. That's what Paul Revere did. He said the British are coming. Climate change is coming, and it's going to have an impact on you. But the opportunity is we've got to give people hope that if we recognize there is economic opportunity in this new economy, but we don't want to oversell it. I think that's what we did when we talked about the creation instantly of green jobs. It takes time, and we've got to put money in it. We need to have more R&D. But we also, and I'm going to go back to something I said earlier, everyone in this room should have a cup of coffee with or sit down and drink beer with a right-wing conservative, with somebody on the religious right. And sort of be curious, how many of you had that conversation in the last week or two? Good. Holy smokes, I'm really impressed. That's really good. And going back to what Mike said, Eckhart, when he got up and he said, his cousins said, my beliefs trump your views. We need to have a dialogue, because these are good, God-fearing people. They're not bad people, but we need to essablish trust and a communication with them and bring them along and find areas in which we can agree. There's a wonderful book. We've all read most of it in sort of its original form, the Bible. But there's now something called the Green Bible, in which passages about stewardship are underlined. There's an incredible amount in the Bible about how we are responsible for taking care of the earth, going back to the Garden of Eden. And that's a great way of reaching out, I find, to the religious right. And I have a copy of the Green Bible, and it's always, I learn something from it. I'm sort of a secular person. but I do like the language in it. It's pretty damn good. If we just try to do this by saying to people, you're wrong, we're right. And part of what Paul Revere did, it's the message, it's the story. And it's going back to what Graham said when he was talking about Al Gore. He's a good, close friend. We've got to have a message here. We've got to have a story. And that's how you move people. It's the narrative. It's the story.
Ted, when did you first really realize climate change was the issue of our time? Was there a eureka moment, or was it just an incrementalism from reading a lot? Do you have any recollection of that?
Yeah, I can. There were two things that happened. One, I was starting to read about it, and I'm sort of skeptical of new ideas that come up. I said, I'm not sure I really believe this, but I read some more. But then I'm lucky enough to spend a lot of time in the outdoors, and I suddenly started noticing migratory patterns of birds were changing. I said, that's really interesting. When you would see birds arriving, or you would see in some cases, robins weren't even migrating south. That was so odd that I said, nature is telling us something. We need to listen to nature better.
Tom, what about yourself? How did you become such an activist?
Well, I live in the Bay Area, and I am on the board at Stanford University, where I went to B school, which I love all the universities in the Bay Area, but I particularly love Stanford. And when I went on the board, I tried to think, what could I possibly do that would help Stanford University? And Stanford basically has a philosophy that the university is supposed to address the biggest problems in the world. So I sat there and thought, what are the problems that we're not addressing, that we don't have the funding to address, that we're not organized to solve? And so I was really sitting there thinking, what are the big issues of the day, indirectly. And the issue that we were not addressing was energy. We had some very good petroleum geologists. We had some very good people in the physical sciences, but we were not dealing with this as a university. And I thought, well, that can be my contribution. And as I got deeper into it, into the technology part of it, through the research being done at Stanford, and then got involved politically through a proposition in California, I realized, oh my goodness, not only is this the biggest issue of the day that's going to affect my kids and me, but also this is an issue that the normal American system is not addressing. And that is when I feel as if I became very directly affected by it, because my normal assumption as an American growing up was, we have a system of politics where there's a lot of screaming and yelling, and you think nothing will ever happen, and then people make a deal and they solve it. And that's what we've done with pollution in the past. We have solved pollution many times in the United States. We know how to do it. But for some reason, I was looking at a political system which is not going to address this. And that's when I thought, that is an enormous problem, and it is a fantastic opportunity for anybody in our generation to make a contribution. If there's a big problem and you have an opportunity to work on its solution the way every generation of Americans has done, that is a great gift. And I felt like, boy, this is as tough as this is my opportunity to do what generations of Americans, including people in my family, have done. So I felt like, wow, as tough as this is, and even if it's going to cause some personal hardship and not necessarily doing the things I would normally choose to do, that is something that I can make fun and do something super fun and something that I think will be productive.
I thought
Let me just comment on something that Tom did. Tom is actively engaged in helping the governor of Washington State get a message out. Jay Inslee, who's the governor, Jay has recognized that the acidification of the Pacific Ocean, and this is old carbon that had been put in 60 or 70 years ago, is welling up, and it's killing the seed oysters, a huge industry in Washington State. Unfortunately, there are a few state senators there that don't quite get it. But through Tom's efforts and the governor's, who's just committed, he's using the demise or potential demise of the oyster industry as the story and as the narrative. And it's just great work.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
So for you, those of you guys, I don't know how many of you guys know of Jay Inslee, who's a former congressman who is the governor of Washington, and who I consider to be an inspirational, really strong person. But we were sitting on we were doing a panel together probably in March, and there were a bunch of elected officials, basically governors, from around the country talking about what they were doing about energy, and they were extremely knowledgeable. They were doing very good work, and they were very much into the details of different programs they were in. And I asked Jay, how do you see this problem in this state of Washington? And Jay said, oh, this is the big problem of the day. We have to figure it out. We have to come up with a solution, and we have to lead the world. That is what Americans have always done. That is what we will do here. And I love Jay Inslee for saying that, because that is actually, he was saying this is a identity issue for us. This is not a problem that's too big for us. This is a problem that's so big that only we can do it. And I thought that was a fantastic thing that he said.
I thought it was interesting. Yesterday, Jimmy Carter talked about being warned, or his administration, about climate from Woods Hole as early as 1979. I think we mentioned Al Gore. I think we all owe Al Gore our appreciation for ringing so many bells with the inconvenient truth and waking people up. What can new groups now are the big deal, as we've been talking about, is funding. Any group trying to attack climate, and there are many of them, are needing funding. What does it take for you to take of a nonprofit group and for you to get interested in them enough to say, is this somebody I want to I want to back? Because that's in a lot of people's minds.
Oh, Douglas.
Well, no, is there something you're looking for in particular out of it? Like you just mentioned, this governor's attitude, a can-doism, a feeling of the practical.
Well, first of all, I think the truth of the matter is this is going to be this is a team effort. There are a number of parts of this puzzle that have to be pursued, and that are going to be pursued by leaders in different areas, a bunch of whom are in this room, a bunch of whom have worked on this harder and smarter, certainly, than I have, and who are going to continue to, and who have done great work. I think the biggest question in my mind at the moment is, I think that there are two big distinctions. One is the distinction between policy and politics. Policy being what is the correct legislation or decision making at the top level that is necessary. Politics is how the heck do we ever get it done? And the second question is the dichotomy between political change and movement. And you'll see those are two different distinctions that I think people conflate a lot. Policy and politics, and movement versus elections. And at this point, I think we're pretty focused, at least in the political side, on elections as opposed to movement. That we say we're going to get a movement by winning elections. We're not going to win elections by having a movement.
What about Mark Udall? What's your take on him? He's in a tough fight here in Colorado. Have you embraced him, or are you looking to help him?
Absolutely. One of the things we're looking for is people where there's a big distinction between the candidates. I think someone was quoting me last night, the League of Conservation Voters marks for the two candidates for Senate in Colorado in 2014. Mark Udall, I think, was literally a 97, and Cory Gardner, I think, was a 9. So, is the League, Gene Karpinski sitting right there, is the League of Conservation Voters always 100% correct? I'm going to say yes. But even if they weren't, that's such a big spread, I think you can drive a semi-truck through that one. And so, it's a very, very close race. And I think that if the people of Colorado get a chance to get the information about who the different people are, then I think that they'll, agree that Mark Udall has been a very good senator and will be a very good senator.
Ted, Theodore Roosevelt was just an extraordinary leader, and particularly corporate groups like to have somebody talk about leadership. I don't want you to do what would TR do today, but is there something about Theodore Roosevelt's leadership in crisis and the way he confronted the denuded forest and the need for reforestation and the need for saving of national parks and wildlife refuges, something about how he managed to pull that off that's that might be useful for political leaders today?
Well, you as a historian know this probably even better than I do. One of the things that impressed me about TR, not long after he got in the White House, he said, I'm of course going to continue all the policies of McKinley. He had to reassure everybody. But he had no intention of doing that at all. And then he embarked on an extraordinary trip. He got on a train and he traveled something like 26,000 miles throughout the country. And he was gone from Washington for weeks and weeks. And you have to ask yourself, and I'll revert that in a moment, who the hell was running Washington when this guy was running all over the country? And what was he doing? He was giving speech after speech, and he was getting to know the American people and letting the American people know them. He was already pretty well known for all the things that he'd done. But it was amazing to see when he'd go to these little small towns, how many people wanted to hear the president speak. And the train would be there, and he'd speak in his high, squeaky voice, and he connected to just literally hundreds of thousands of Americans. He engaged, and that was partly one of the reasons I think he was so extraordinarily successful, because people really adored him. But the second thing that he did was when he was setting up the first wildlife refuge, he said, is there any reason that I can't do it? Why can't I issue an executive act? And people said, well, no, Mr. President, there's no reason you can't do it. Then I so declare it. There will be a refuge here. He wasn't afraid to act. So those were sort of two things that I think made a big difference.
Do you feel President Obama's done enough on climate? He has injected it in both of his inaugural addresses, and he's as an educator, he's certainly part of the climate world. But do you think he needs to be doing more?
Yes, I do. I do. I'm reluctant to criticize a president of the United States because I've not stood in his boots. It's a hard role. But the president, in my opinion, needs to engage more. He needs to get out. And frankly, if I were the president of the United States, I'd tell the Secret Service, your job is to figure out how I can see more Americans and can sit down and talk to them and have cups of coffee and get out in the country and actually meet and hear them and let them know what I think and why I think. Presidents recently have been encased in this bubble in Washington, and they work with 10 or 12 advisors, and that's all who they see. And that doesn't work. The president has to get out and see the American public, and there has to be two-way conversation between them.
I wanted to ask you, let's give him a hand. I wanted to ask both of you, I'll start with you, Ted. Was there an iconic landscape that you particularly love? I know you travel the world and have seen beautiful places, but there is some place that's a touchstone outdoor place, a park or a river or something that really means a lot to you in your life?
There are two. One is Alaska. The first time I went to Alaska to go fishing, I'd spent probably 3 weeks in Tokyo in China, and it was all on business, and it was hot, and it was humid, and it was polluted, and I finally sent an email to a fishing lodge in Alaska and said, I want to come. I changed my plans. I wasn't going back to New York. To the hell with New York. I'm spending too much time there. And I arrived in Alaska, and I remember flying up and arriving at this little fishing lodge, and I said, my God, I'm in this incredible country. Look at this. And the guides and I just hit it off, and we had a fantastic time. Walking, paddling, flying, and I got to see for the first time, and then I went up a number of times later. It was a revelatory experience. And the second experience was when I was all of 18 years old, and I came out to work in the state a little bit to the north, Wyoming, and I was working for the Bureau of Land Management, and I'd work in our national forests, and the problems were the same problems we have. It was over water. Who owned the spring? Was it the Bureau of Land Management, or was it a local rancher? And I found, and I really got to know some of these ranchers who were great people, and on the weekends, I got to see the land the best way there is to see the land in the West, and that's with a horse between my legs. There's no better way to see this land and to love it and understand what it's all about. I'd get up early in the morning, and I'd come back to the stable tired. The horse was tired, but we had just seen some magnificent things. And if all Americans could have that extraordinary opportunity to see this incredible country either on their own 2 feet or with a horse under their legs, it's magnificent. And we are so lucky to benefit from the heritage that we've been given.
Very great.
Give a round for that.
Yeah.
So, place that I love physically. Well, in the summer of 1976, I was working on a cattle ranch in Nevada, and it's really dry near Gardnerville, Nevada, and this was not particularly luxurious cattle ranch, and they weren't doing all that well, but it was 13 miles from Lake Tahoe. So I actually was doing all the things that Ted was saying. You know, I was riding my horse to fix fence. I was having a great summer. I was making $100 a month and having a great time. And I drove over. My parents said, go to Lake Tahoe and visit these friends. Our friends have a house on Lake Tahoe, and go see them. So I went over, and I don't know how many of you guys have seen Lake Tahoe, but it's 88 miles around, and it's, you know, about a mile deep. It's incredibly clear, surrounded by mountains. And having been in the dustiest, driest place I had ever been, driving over the hill and seeing that lake and then going down, I thought, my God, this is absolutely heaven. And I live near Lake Tahoe, and I go all the time, and I still think it's pretty much heaven.
Yeah, very
Wow, they paid you $100 a month. You got overpaid for that.
That was 6 days a week.
I always was moved by the redwood country of California and the giant redwood trees. You know, when John Muir would use religious language sometimes, you know, like a cathedral, and Theodore Roosevelt would use religious language with the redwood trees are just, if we ever lost those groves, I don't know what I'd do. And there was a story in the New York Times yesterday about the stresses that climate is placing on the sequoias trees. It's really quite an alarming story, and if you haven't read it, just pull it up online from the Times. We only have about 5 minutes left, and I wanted to backtrack on two things that were raised today that are a little bit some things that you don't hear often at a climate conference, and I think that's the point of Aspen, is ideas that, you know, that go a little bit counterintuitive at times. We were talking about religion, and we've talked about the churches, and it does seem, if you look at the civil rights history, Dr. Martin Luther King used the churches, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and he used that as a network. How do we bring the climate message and the stewardship of Earth message and not think of them as right-wing evangelicals or get the politics out of it? How do we use the church structure of America to start doing sermons about climate and to start educating parishioners about the climate issue? How can we do that?
Well, I think one of the ways we want to do that is we need to actually talk to the churches and say, we have similar beliefs that you do. We care about the earth. You care about the earth. And let's try to figure out how we can work together to do a better job being stewards. I go back to Matthew 2:5, I think, the parable of the talents. That's about stewardship, amongst other things. This is an integral part of the Bible. And I think we need to reach out and understand better why some of the conservative churches don't like the environmentalists. What is it that we are doing that alienates them? Let's become more sensitive to that. And some of it is some social issues which are difficult, and we need to sort of speak softly around those social issues. You know what I'm talking about, pro-choice right to life. We're talking about saving the earth. And we also, I think, need to be very adroit and recognize that there are different views of how you go about doing this within the church. The evangelicals have different views amongst themselves. The Protestant movement, the Roman Catholic Church is really very advanced in some of this thinking, and we've now seen what the Pope has said about this. This is great. We need to get more of that. We should sit down and talk with some of the bishops. And the Orthodox Church, which is very creative, is also, and informing ourselves, and I'm not nearly as well informed about this as I need to be, so that we can talk to them and do exactly what Tom was saying. This is a team effort. They need to be part of our team, and we need to be part of their team.
Can I address that?
Yeah,
Doug?
jump in.
So, obviously, it would be absolutely fantastic if the religious communities in the United States embraced a progressive energy and climate message. And there are two big arguments. Ted referred to one of them, which is stewardship of the earth, that is all through the Western tradition in terms of God giving us a planet to take care of. The other one, which is people don't realize, but is actually very big both in the evangelical and in Catholic traditions, is caring for the most vulnerable amongst us. That this is going to be something that the poorest and least protected people in our society are going to suffer from disproportionately, and therefore dealing with it is going to be a very direct way of protecting the most vulnerable. So, and we've gone out and tried to address directly the Catholic Church, which is very progressive, and this Pope is, in my opinion, could be the person who has the most impact on this issue in the world, including the United States. And I actually, I truly believe that, and I believe there's a chance for transformational change through that. I also believe that there are very large Protestant evangelical groups who could embrace this. But when I've talked to political people about this, and so last year we were involved in a governor's race in Virginia. So Virginia is actually a purple state. It's kind of a traditional conservative southern state in the southern half, and a suburb of Washington, D.C. in the northern half. So when you think about Virginia, it really is a purple state. And we wanted to go directly to people who believed in God and make these two arguments and say, will you help us in this election? Because one of the people's very good, one of the people's very bad in terms of energy and climate. And the political people amongst us were very concerned about getting them too involved, because this is not the only issue in the United States of America. And even if we won on this issue with those people, it could be that they would vote for the person who we thought was the worst candidate because of all the other issues that Ted referred to, social issues and what I would think of as group issues, who do I feel comfortable with? So in fact, I do believe this is a potential game changer for the people in this room, but I also want to say that when you think about organizations, particularly religions touch people in a lot of ways and very deeply. So that if you are a member of an evangelical church, you don't just go to church for an hour in the morning. Your kids go to their preschool. Your kids go to their after school. You are touched by that organization. Your life is often organized in many ways through that organization. And so when you think about, you really can't use people in organizations. You've got to accept them and say, how much of them can they, is this going to be the leading issue for them that's going to make them not just support us in some way, but actually incorporate it and change their behavior politically? Because if we need a political change, you have to ask, is that a bridge too far?
Even in the West, Mormons were original great land stewards because everybody else was moving west to extract, mining, timbering, asbestos, zinc, copper, gold, and the Mormon communities were coming to settle. And that one Mormon community didn't pollute a river because it would pollute the next Mormon river. And that's why Stuart Udall, that was the great Interior Secretary, was Mormon. And Mo Udall did so much to save wild Alaska. And it's why Mark Udall has that high rating on conservation, and Harry Reid of the Mormon Church. Sometimes now we say, Mormons are right-wing and they're on the right. Well, there is an old stewardship tradition with that. I wanted to, and one thing that might come of that, if we can earmark a rabbi, a priest, and a minister who's doing great work on climate and trying to get them more cable television time. If some of you guys can invite them to conferences like that, so we could start making some notice of that. I think that could be very useful to start, finding who those religious leaders are. We got to end, but the last quick question, and we have time for Q&A. We'll take just one question from right here. Go ahead.
The question I have, which I think is important.
Hold on for the microphone.
Oh. We have a Democrat and a Republican, an environmentalist, a conservationist. Both of you are businessmen. Both of you believe in climate change and the immediacy and need and critical need. How can you, both of you believe in public-private partnerships and the market forces. You both believe in influencing policy. How can you use your common ground to build across the aisle and work together?
If it were up to Ted and me, we could solve this in about 15 minutes. That's the truth. This isn't about Ted Roosevelt and Tom Steyer not being able to agree.
What encourages me is that there is a large part of America that are centrist. But it's hard to be a centrist. You have to belong to one of the parties. And the parties aren't really working very well together. So what I hope we see happening is the centrists will come together and work harder, and there will be more of an incentive and more of a desire to work across the aisles. That's what we want to encourage.
You know, it's funny, I'll tell you one last story. I went to the party, to the 90th birthday party of George Shultz, and he had actually several 90th birthday parties because he's a pretty popular guy. And I went to a couple of them, but I was sitting at a table. There are 8 people, and there were probably 80 people in the room. And I knew that there were 78 Republicans and 2 Democrats. There was one other Democrat in the room. So I'm sitting, and he wasn't at my table. So I'm sitting at this table of 8 people with 7 Republicans. I'm sitting next to the wife of a bank CEO who was very nice. We have this nice conversation back and forth. And at the end of the meal, she goes, "You seem so normal. Why are you a Democrat?" And I actually think as long as we're asking each other that question, we're going to be fine.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.